Good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join us for this month's Simon Talks. I'm Paul here in Cork Simon Community. Wayne Stanley asked me to step in for him this morning. He can't make it, and he sends his apologies. I'm sure many of you know that this Simon Talk series is part of the core work that the Simon Communities of Ireland does around research and policy, and we're very lucky to be able to draw on the experience and the insights and the work of so many people to open up a broad discussion on a host of issues relating to housing and homelessness, and they are many. As people are joining, I'll just briefly do some housekeeping. We'll have plenty of time afterwards this morning for your questions. So please write your questions into the chat or the Q&A function. You'll find that at the bottom of your screen, and no need to wait till the end to do so. Just write them in as they occur to you, and we'll get to them all, or we'll do our best to get to them all, time committing. If you'll be commenting on your social channels during the talk, and please do, we would ask you to use the hashtag #SimonTalks. So this month's Simon Talks, a vision for Ireland's private rental sector. Some of you will be familiar with our Locked Out of the Market series of papers every quarter. It offers a snapshot of what it's like trying to find a place to rent if you're homeless or on the very edge of homelessness, and it's never a pretty picture. The private rental sector is something our guest speaker this month is very familiar with. Dr. Michael Byrne is a lecturer in the School of Social Policy, Social Work and Social Justice at UCD, and he's director of the Equality Studies Master's Programme. Michael's research focuses on the political economy of housing, with a particular focus on the private rental sector, the impact of cost rental housing, security, affordability, and place is one of his current research projects in which he's the principal investigator. The project is funded by the Housing Agency. Michael is also currently in the process of writing a book on the political economy of the private rental sector, and Polity Press will publish that in due course. Recently, Michael contributed a chapter on the reform of the Irish private rental sector in Professor Peter Kemp's edited volume, Private Renting in the Advanced Economies, Growth Change in a Financialized World. And Michael has also written an article which was published in the Housing Studies Journal. The article was called Post-Neoliberalisation and the Irish Private Rental Sector. And I'm sure many of you also will be familiar with Michael's writing in the Week in Housing newsletter. We're delighted that he could take time out from what is obviously a very busy schedule to join us this month for our Simon Talk series. It promises to be a thought-provoking and insightful talk as Michael takes us through his vision for Ireland's private rental sector. So I'll hand it over to you, Michael.
Thanks very much, Paul, for that very kind introduction. Let me just go into screen share mode. Okay, so that looks like it's working well. Thanks everyone for joining us this morning on a Monday morning, and thanks to Paul for the introduction, to Simon Communities for the invitation to be here this morning, and to Rebecca Hamilton for her work in supporting the organisation of today's webinar. What I'm going to be presenting today is a proposal for the reform of private rental sector tenancies, and it's a set of ideas I first developed in my newsletter, The Week in Housing, and later in an opinion piece for the Irish Examiner. But I'm delighted to have the opportunity this morning to flesh out and develop the ideas further, and especially to get feedback from those present today. So with a view to leaving plenty of time for discussion, I'll dive in and kick off without further ado. Hang on. So the starting point for today's webinar is really the idea that security of tenure is the kind of missing piece in terms of the reform of the private rental sector. Some people might say it's a little bit provocative or even unfair, but I would characterize security of tenure in Ireland's private rental sector as being very weak, on the basis that the number of days that a tenant can be sure they won't receive a notice of termination is effectively zero. And that's frustrating because there has been a lot of positive work in relation to security of tenure over recent years. The importance of establishing the private rental sector as a long-term form of housing was identified already back in the strategy for the rental sector, which is not far off 10 years ago. And we've also seen a whole series of important policy reforms in the space. We've seen the introduction of longer notice periods for tenancy terminations. We've seen a tightening of the kind of regulatory context in terms of notices of terminations needing to be registered with the Residential Tenancies Board. We've seen the abolition of mass evictions in some contexts under the Tyrrellstown Amendment, the shift towards indefinite tenancies, etc., etc. And there's also been lots of great research and campaigning around security of tenure from academics, but also from service providers, homeless organizations, including Simon Communities. But in spite of all this important work, from a tenant's perspective, the dial hasn't shifted significantly from where we were in 2014 when it first became clear that the private rental sector was beginning to experience a profound crisis. And the obstacle to really addressing once and for all the security of tenure issue has been primarily the prioritization of investment and supply of private rental housing on the part, of course, of government, of successive governments. And we've seen this, for example, in relation to the debate on the withdrawal of the eviction ban. And it was very clear in how government framed that the view is that investment and supply are the core objectives, and that's what will underpin a successful private rental sector, and that security of tenure, while desirable, is kind of it comes in second place, so to speak. And there's a lot of reasons why those arguments make sense. It's a very understandable position because, of course, there are huge problems with the supply of housing in general in Ireland and with the availability of private rental housing in particular. However, I suppose one of the core things I want to argue today is I think we need to move beyond the tendency to see supply and security of tenure in kind of zero-sum terms, or to kind of prioritize one over the other unduly, and instead move to a situation in which we see these as both being core objectives of private rental sector policy. In other words, the focus needs to shift to finding a balance between these two things rather than prioritizing one over the other, especially prioritizing investment over security. And sometimes I think about the analogy of car engineers here. If you can imagine two sets of car engineers, one set are saying cars are all about getting to a destination, so they need to be able to go fast. Another set are saying, well, safety should be our chief concern, so cars should be all about braking. And obviously, the debate would be much more fruitful if it was focused on how we can balance and integrate these two core objectives rather than trading them off one against the other. So in a sense, today's presentation is really an attempt, a kind of a thought experiment in terms of developing and identifying what an optimum balance of security of tenure and supply or investment would look like, but also to kind of clarify what is at stake in both of these issues in the private rental sector and in the relationship between them. So that's going to be our focus today. I'll begin by discussing the issue of security of tenure and how I think we should approach it, and then the issue of investment and how I think we should approach it, and then finally I'll set out my proposal for how these two issues can be reconciled, if you like. But before I get started, I do think it's useful to make explicit some of the kind of premises of the perspective I'll present today, or the background assumptions, because they might help to provide context in terms of the direction I'm taking. So first of all, my view is, and this is something that's argued very strongly in the Housing Commission report published last week, that we need to move from reactive to proactive policy making and from short-term to long-term policy making in general, but especially with regard to the private rental sector. What I mean by that is the proposal that I'm going to describe today is it's not focused on addressing or reacting to the problems that are there today. It's more focused on putting in place a framework for tenancies in the private rental sector that won't generate those types of problems. So it's maybe a subtle distinction, but I think it's an important one. And similarly, in terms of the short term versus long term, I think we need a framework for the private rental sector, which not just works in the current context, which is one of inadequate supply, growing rents, etc., but will work through different contexts, different market cycles, for example, because we know the problems and the nature of the private rental sector there today are not going to be there forever. There'll be periods where rents are declining, where demand is declining, etc. So we need a robust framework that can give stability to the sector over the medium to long term. And in terms of thinking about that type of approach, I would argue that supply and stability are two equally important criteria or values that should underpin how we think about policy making in the private rental sector and in relation to housing in general. So housing supply needs to be responsive to demand. I won't say anything more about that because I think most people will agree with that. But I think stability is an equally important, and also there's a kind of they support each other, these stability and supply. And what I mean by stability is, I mean, on the one hand, at the level of the housing system as a whole, at the kind of macro level, things like robust macro-prudential regulation that we have in relation to mortgages from the central bank, multi-annual budgets in terms of government investment in housing, diverse forms of finance that can provide stability, both in terms of public and private finance over the medium to long term. These types of issues which can underpin a housing system which can be stable, because if there's one thing we've learned in the last 20 years, it's that one of the central challenges of the Irish housing system has been the incredible level of volatility. But stability is also important at the level of the residents. So I think residential stability should be a really important value that underpins how we approach policy making. And that means, in other words, reducing residential instability. And a very simple way to think about that is just in terms of reducing the number of involuntary housing transitions that take place, or the number of involuntary housing moves that take place within the system. And I would be of the view that the fewer of those we have, the easier it'll be for everybody involved, including residents in the housing system. And that stability is beneficial not just for residents, but it's also beneficial for investors, it's beneficial for developers, housing providers, service providers, regulators, etc. It makes everybody's job a hell of a lot easier and can underpin better housing outcomes. I'm also assuming that we want, as a society, that we want to have a private rental sector of reasonable scale. So there's different views on this. Some people argue we should reduce the proportion of households that live in the private rental sector. There's very strong arguments in favor of that, but others point out the demographic trends, which, for example, higher levels of inward migration or changing household formations and preferences, that would indicate that the private rental sector today needs to be larger than, say, it's the historical norm. So there's different views on that. I'm not going to get into it today, but I'm assuming that we certainly don't want a radical collapse in investment or in the availability of private rental housing. And I'm also assuming that the rent regulation framework, in terms of the rent pressure zone legislation, is remaining in place, and that essentially not much more can be done in terms of direct rent regulation policy with regard to the affordability issue. So I think affordability can be strengthened through other aspects of the housing system, such as the expansion of social and affordable sectors. But I'm assuming that the current setup for rent regulation is will remain in place, and the approach to tenancies that I'm going to advocate is one that is designed to work in tandem with that. Although the Housing Commission did recommend some reform of the of rent regulation, it's maybe worth noting in passing. Okay, so let's jump into security of tenure first. So if we want to balance these two things of security of tenure and supply and investment, we need to have a kind of clear idea of what we mean by these things and why they're important, what their nature is. So I think everybody here today will have a very good understanding of the significance of security of tenure, so I won't spend much time on this. But I think a couple of things are worth drawing out as being crucial when we think about security of tenure. So first of all, the literature, the academic literature on what home is, the meaning of home, the significance of home, is extremely clear on this, and often using the concept of ontological security, academics argue that security, meaning the stability and predictability of the home over time, is core to what home is. So this suggests that anyone who doesn't have security, doesn't have predictability of their dwelling over time, does not have access to a home in the full sense of the term. And there's a very strong consensus among academic researchers on that point. Moreover, the literature demonstrating the importance of security for well-being and for a variety of other important outcomes is now really overwhelming. So there is an enormous body of literature, both quantitative and qualitative, which shows that insecure housing has negative impacts on physical health, on mental health, on employment participation, on residential satisfaction, on childhood development, etc., etc. So I really think it's time that we started to take that evidence much more seriously in terms of how we think the private rental sector, and that anybody who's arguing that security of tenure should not be a core priority on a par with investment really needs to engage with that literature and make their arguments on that basis, which I think they'll have a very tough time doing. But residential instability or insecurity doesn't just have negative impacts for tenants, it also creates challenges for other actors in the housing system, such as regulators, service providers, and our rent subsidy system. So insecurity, when we zoom out and look at the role it plays in the overall housing system, we pay a really significant cost for our choice of not prioritizing security of tenure. And that cost should be taken into account whenever we're assessing the kind of relative importance of different objectives within the private rental sector. At the very least, it should be taken into account. But the big takeaway from my point of view is that security of tenure, it's not an optional add-on or luxury. It can't be something that we think is nice to have, but not necessary in the private rental sector. It needs to be front and center in how we think about putting in place a framework which can function for tenants and for the housing system and can underpin policy for the long term. And I also just briefly want to clarify what I mean or what is at stake in terms of security of tenure, because it's often thought that security of tenure primarily relates to the duration of the tenancy, just tenancy lengths. And while that is important, I actually think there's some other aspects of security of tenure which are equally or perhaps even more important from the point of view of the tenant's experience of security, how secure a tenant feels in their dwelling. And these issues relate to the kind of predictability of the tenancy duration. So not just how long it lasts, but how confident the tenant can feel in how long it will last at any given time. And this dimension relates to issues such as the nature of the grounds according to which a tenancy can be terminated, the extent to which those grounds are specified and subject to regulatory oversight, and perhaps most importantly, the extent to which the tenant has agency over those grounds. So to what extent can a tenant be sure that if they take certain actions, it will lead to the tenancy remaining stable. So these in my view are in some ways the most important things we need to get right about security of tenure if we want tenants to feel secure in their homes. And then finally, the relationship between tenant and landlord. There's a growing body of research showing that this is in fact one of the key things that underpins private tenants' experience of housing and of security in particular. Okay, so that's security of tenure. I'll just say a couple of brief points to clarify what we mean when we talk about investment in the private rental sector and why it's important. So there is an argument that housing and home shouldn't be investment assets, and there are very strong arguments to make in that regard. Nevertheless, if they're not, we won't have a private rental sector. So the housing as an asset obviously underpins both household and institutional investment in the private rental sector. There is another, so there's an investment in the private rental sector is obviously fundamental to the sector, but it's also important to underline that a proportion of private rental housing does not arise from investment per se in the specific sense of that term, but instead arises from accidental landlords, because there are a variety of cases or situations in which the owner of a residential property will find themselves in a situation where they're unable to or don't wish to occupy their property. So if an owner moves to another country for an undefined period of time, or moves back in with their parents to act as a carer for an undefined period of time, and a whole host of other life circumstances related issues that can lead to someone not occupying a dwelling that they own for a period of time. And accidental landlords play an important role for two reasons. I mean, we could argue that housing is not something that should be provided on an accidental basis, and there's strong arguments for that, which I'd be, I'm very open to. However, accidental landlords, from the point of view of availability of housing, play an important role, but also from the point of view of the efficient use of the housing stock, because if it weren't possible for accidental landlords to let out their properties, that would result in higher levels of vacancy. And the efficient use of the housing stock is important when supply is constrained, which is the current case in Ireland, but it's also important in general because, of course, we need to use our housing stock efficiently, given that any increase in the housing stock has an impact from a carbon emissions point of view and from a climate point of view. So it's going to be, in the years to come, that issue of efficient use of the housing stock is going to be it's going to become more important, not less important. The key point anyway is that for landlord investors, be they institutional or household, the what underpins their involvement in private rental housing is the ability to obtain rental income, obviously, and to realize capital gains through the sale of property. From an accidental landlord point of view, it's slightly different. I think it's reasonable to argue that their chief concern is to be able to recover the property, be it for sale or for use. So for both of these cohorts within the private rental sector, the key issue is recovery of property, I would argue. And therefore, the key tension in relation to the private rental sector is that between the recovery of the property on the part of the landlord and the tenant's enjoyment of security of tenure. That is really what I suppose it boils down to. And that is the core tension that the focus of policy making and of the debate around private rental sector policy, in my view, should be very clear, specifically focused on addressing this core tension and finding a way to reconcile these two issues. So that's what I'll turn to now in the next part of this morning's webinar. How can we reconcile security and supply? So my proposal is based on splitting the private rental sector into two different streams, if you like, based on landlord type. So the first stream, and the most important, is what I call full security tenancies, which I'll discuss momentarily, which would be the mainstream private rental sector, if you like, which is appropriate and viable from the point of view of landlord investors. The second stream is a short-term subsector of the private rental sector, which is targeted specifically at that cohort of accidental landlords. So the first kind of idea, I suppose, that I think is useful, at least as a thought experiment, is to split the private rental sector in this fashion based on landlord type. And in so doing, I'll argue, we open up much more possibilities in terms of the ability of policy to reconcile security and supply. So I'll go through these both in some detail, and I'll begin with the what I call full security tenancies. Okay, this is very straightforward. We're talking here about tenancies, which would be of a duration of 6 years, I propose, and in which terminations of the tenancy would be limited to breach of tenant obligations. So that means it would not be possible to terminate a tenancy on the grounds of sale of property, family or personal use, or renovation. Say all of these issues are really important. Sale of property is probably the biggest one in terms of being the driver of tenancy terminations currently. So what we have here is a setup which would provide comprehensive security of tenure for tenants within the tenancy period, but which would be time limited and would allow for the recovery of the property by the landlord at the end of the 6-year period without any grounds being provided. So that's the core idea of what I call full security tenancies. So let's just think a little bit about some of the benefits of this type of approach, and then I'll talk about the limitations as well. So in terms of providing really robust security of tenure, this approach gives tenants the agency to determine whether or not their tenancy continues for the full tenancy period. And that, from a tenant's point of view, crucially kind of kicks the ball into their court for the first time. And what, in my view, is the prerequisite of decisively changing the game in terms of how security of tenure functions. If we give tenants that agency, if we empower them in that regard, they'll have control over the duration of their tenancy and over the stability of their home. Related to that, it grants predictability in the sense that I've just described, but also in the sense that the ending of the tenancy is known in advance. So the tenant knows that at the end of 6 years, either the tenancy will terminate or it will be renewed. But this gives tenants a long time period within which to prepare for their next housing transition. Now, this is crucial because the lack of predictability and therefore unexpected tenancy terminations is one of the crucial drivers of residential instability. It's one of the crucial drivers of chaotic housing transitions. And for every chaotic housing transition, we increase the risk of homelessness and other poor outcomes, as well as just subjecting tenants to an enormous amount of stress. And obviously, by introducing predictability, we can make it much more likely that housing transitions are successful and have a reduced impact on the tenant, but also makes the job of service providers and homeless service providers, for example, and preventing homelessness a hell of a lot easier. And finally, it gives clarity in terms of the nature of the tenancy and the extent to which landlords can terminate a tenancy. From a tenant's point of view, they know that if they receive a tenancy termination and they haven't breached their obligations, they know it's definitely invalid. So this should allow tenants to much more easily determine whether or not a notice of termination is valid, and clarify the situation for landlords as well. So that should strengthen compliance. It should reduce the number of disputes registered with the RTB, for example. In general, it should make the regulation of the sector and compliance within the sector better, coupled with the fact that with much stronger security of tenure, tenants are in a much better position to advocate for themselves vis-a-vis their landlord and to make use of the services such as dispute resolution and other services that are already in place, because we know that when tenants feel insecure in their housing, it makes it much more difficult for them to advocate for themselves. That's something I researched in the past and published a report on with Threshold back in 2020, I think it was. Okay, but there are some limitations here that are worth touching on briefly. First of all, it doesn't provide lifetime security of tenure, which will be desirable and which some other jurisdictions have managed to achieve, so it's not a pipe dream. The 6 years is somewhat arbitrary. So I've chosen 6 years in part because it's a time period that's already provided for in the Residential Tenancies Act, although we are transitioning away from that and towards indefinite tenancies currently. But nevertheless, there is, I suppose, there's a basis for it there in legislation. But more importantly, it's a time period which I think works for tenants in terms of being a reasonably long period of time, but also can work for landlords. So I'll return to that second part in a second. But there is an arbitrary element there. It could be 7 years, could be 8 years, could be 5 years. So I mean, ultimately, we would want more research to identify the if you like, the perfect kind of sweet spot. Probably the biggest limitation is that it doesn't incorporate the possibility of sales of properties with tenants in situ, which is something that's common in some other jurisdictions. It's also something that's recommended by the Housing Commission. So I've chosen not to go down this avenue because currently the private rental sector, and especially the housing market and the mortgage market, is not set up in Ireland really to facilitate the sale of rental properties with tenants in situ. And I would be concerned that going down that road could negatively impact investment unduly. So nevertheless, there's a lot of potential there, and some people have done a lot of work on this. I think Social Democrats in particular have talked about the possibility of this. So it's definitely something that I'm open to, and I think more needs to be done in that regard. And I need to learn more about how that might work in the Irish context. Obviously, we have the recent tenant in situ schemes in Ireland, which are kind of specific schemes that involve public or bodies purchasing private rental housing. So I'm referring to the more general situation in my comments. And then finally, the other issue is, what would the impact be on investment and supply? So there would be some impact here. So it's important that we clarify that. And that brings us to the issue of investment in the private rental sector and how that relates to what I've just described. Now, some comments are warranted here before we get into it, and I'll be very brief here just for time reasons. I've included a few slides on this. People are welcome for me to share the slides with them, but I won't have time to go into them. But the core point is a challenge in understanding the impact of any reform of the private rental sector on investment and supply is that we don't know the nature of net investment in the private rental sector in Ireland. Okay, so there are some data sources which are routinely drawn on in the public debate and in the media, which do give us an insight into what's going on in terms of net investments, but they don't give a comprehensive picture. So the great work has been done by the Residential Tenancies Board in improving the register of tenancies and moving to annual registrations and so forth. And that will, I think in the future, that will give us a much better picture of what's happening. But it's such a recent change that we can't really infer much from that in terms of net investment currently. Likewise, the RTB now provides really valuable data on the issuing of notices of tenancies, of terminations and the grounds. But again, a very recent data series, and it has been subject to a couple of significant changes. So it's not something we can infer too much from currently. And finally, we have the property price register data, which again sheds a lot of important insights, but it doesn't give us a clear picture of how many landlords are exiting and how many landlords are entering the sector in a given time period. So there's a bit of a question mark around what is the actual extent and nature of investment in the private rental sector in Ireland, net investment being the key thing we would need to understand, and that is a challenge for policy making and for anybody who's interested in these issues. A second challenge is when we look at the international literature, it's also not very clear. So there's a lot of research on the impact of rent regulation on the supply of housing, but there's very little research on the impact of non-rent regulation forms of policy reform in the private rental sector on investment. Things like security of tenure, enforcement, minimum standards. And there's a recent, published last year, review of the international evidence by Marsh et al., which is very, very helpful piece of research, but they conclude that the evidence base internationally is extremely thin, and that in the absence of robust evidence, policymakers and analysts frequently have to rely on theoretical assumptions and beliefs when trying to assess the impact of, for example, security of tenure reforms on investment. So we don't really have a clear understanding at that level either. Okay, so what can we say? I mean, that does put a limit on what we can say about this issue. Nevertheless, my argument today is that the 6-year time horizon gives a reasonable period within which landlords can recover their properties and realize capital gains, such as they are. And you know, again, I don't have time to really go into it in detail now because I'm looking at the time there. I do want to leave time for discussion. But if we look at the RTB survey of small landlords, so this is specifically looking at landlords of 1 or 2 properties, that research suggests that a large majority, even amongst the smaller landlords, are medium to long-term investors. And my interpretation of that data is that a 6-year time horizon would be a feasible time period from the point of view of small landlord investors. It would certainly be a reasonable time period from the point of view of larger landlords and institutional landlords. But even for those smaller landlords, most of them, based on the data we do have, are medium, a large majority are medium and long-term investors. Okay, so a couple of further notes here. So I think this 6-year tenancies can balance tenants' need for security with landlords' need to recover their property. It can also, I would argue, provide a long-term framework for the private rental sector by essentially resolving the security of tenure issue in a way which is compatible with investments. It can underpin a stable policy regime, especially if such an approach could garner cross-party support. And that would be a hugely valuable thing from the point of view of landlord investors, because obviously policy change and policy risk, and there is international evidence of this, are some of the major disincentives for investment in the private rental sector. So if we can address those issues, we can actually support investment in the sector by making a more stable investment and predictable investment environment. However, shorter term investors will be driven out of the private rental sector. Now, that's not ideal in a context when the availability of property is so important. So I acknowledge that. Nevertheless, there are benefits to driving out short-term investors, because obviously there's a very strong argument that housing is being a critical public service, and in just the nature of housing, it's not amenable to short-term investment. And therefore, we'll actually end up with better housing outcomes if we create an environment which is not suitable for, and in which short-term investors don't participate. And that could lead to better outcomes for tenants. It could lead to professionalization, higher levels of compliance, an easier job for the regulator, etc. Finally, however, 6-year tenancies are obviously not appropriate for accidental landlords who are unlikely to be in a position to relinquish their properties for a 6-year, which is a reasonably long time period. So this is where the second component of my proposal comes in, the idea of a short-term subsector aimed at accidental landlords. So the idea here, and I won't develop this as much, is to have a specified short-term tenancy period of 2 years. Now, within that 2-year period, the landlord will be able to recover their property on the basis of sale of property or family use, in addition to the usual breach of tenant obligations grounds. So this would mean if somebody goes to another country to work for a year, they can come back and recover their property without issue. At the end of that 2-year period, the tenancy must either exit the private rental sector or automatically convert into a full security tenancy. In other words, the 6-year tenancy system. So it's time limited. That's an important aspect of this. And most importantly, this type of rental housing will be based on applying for and receiving a short-term license, which would be based on issued on a once-in-a-lifetime basis. So any individual could only apply to have such a license once in their lifetime. So the reason for that is because the circumstances under which a person would find themselves being an accidental landlord are reasonably limited and unlikely to occur multiple times in a person's life. Most importantly, this would prevent the abuse of short-term letting as a way of avoiding the tenancy protections involved in the full security tenancy end of things. So that's obviously would be crucial. So this is a specific kind of subsector which provides much weaker security of tenure for tenants, and that's a big drawback, but does enable accidental landlords to remain within the private rental sector. Okay. Biggest point here is that currently the entire private rental sector is designed to facilitate accidental landlords, right? So a lot of the obstacle to sorting out security of tenure for once and for all is the argument that there are some landlords out there who've gone abroad, or they've, in whatever situation, they're going to need to recover their property. Fair enough. But do we need every single tenant in the private rental sector to be deprived of security of tenure in order to facilitate this minority of landlords? I don't think we do. And I think it's really holding us back an attempt to do just that. So by having that short-term sector, we can kind of isolate accidental landlords from the mainstream of the private rental sector, but still have an efficient use of the housing stock. The concern here is that the proportion of accidental landlords is a bit of an unknown quantity. I'm really running out of time now, so we probably need to have a clearer understanding of the scale of accidental landlords within the private rental sector to be able to develop this more fully. So then just the very last thing I'll say is there's a number of aspects of the report to the Housing Commission on the rental sector, which I think dovetail very well with my proposal. Mainly the importance of clarifying, simplifying the regulatory framework around tenancies in the private rental sector, the aim of ensuring long-term security, which would make the sector attractive for tenants, And also the idea of the kind of tax treatment issue. Now, the whole tax treatment of landlords is a separate issue that I'm not going to talk about here, and it's a very divisive issue, lots of different views on it. But if government were to choose to introduce a different tax regime for landlords linked to greater security of tenure, full security tenure tenancies that I've advocated would be, I think, a model that would gel very well with that policy objective. There are a number of other benefits to what I'm proposing, but I'm going to stop there to ensure we have some time for questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I think we're running out of time because there is so much to digest. That was a very comprehensive presentation. I liked your term thought experiment, which suggests this is very much a work in progress, but obviously you've considered this very carefully and looked at it from a whole lot of different perspectives, not least looking at the challenges for both the landlord investor and the tenant. I thought some of the language was interesting, stability, predictability, empowerment. We see the opposite quite often as a result of a lack of housing. We see the instability, the unpredictability, and people being disempowered. Looking at it, there's a few questions there, but just briefly, I wonder, is there a dimension worth exploring as well? And that's from a tenancy point of view, and that's the nature of households, with single households being the fastest growing household in the state. And from a supply point of view, is that something that we need to consider more carefully?
Sorry, Paul, I'm very sorry, but I just missed the very last part there.
I'm just wondering, is household type among tenants something that we need to consider better, given that single households are the fastest growing household in the state and quite often are on the bottom rung of the ladder when it comes to housing priority?
Yeah, I mean I absolutely think that's true, and I think that relates more so to the supply side of things and the housing delivery side of things. Obviously, our existing stock is very badly skewed towards larger houses, so there is a growing mismatch over time between the nature of the housing stock and the nature of households, that's for sure. So we should address that, and I think there is a bias against one person houses or houses that are designed for smaller households within Irish culture, we could say, and we see that with a lot of opposition to one-bedroom apartments and arguments that family housing is what's needed, so-called family housing, and I think we definitely need to move past those. But I think that's really a concern for the planning, for more so the planning system and how we approach that side of things, rather than from how we think about the nature of tenancies. That would be my response.
Let's get to some questions here. One, what about a third sector for institutional landlords with lifetime security of tenure? Such landlords don't need to de-tenant when they sell.
Yeah, it's different. It's a very good point. There's different views. There's different views on that. I do think it would be possible. A couple of caveats. One question would be, is it needed? If institutional landlords are not generating a lot of the residential instability or housing insecurity that's in the private rental sector, is it needed? So that's a consideration. The second thing would be, institutional landlords in Ireland are poorly understood. So there's often a view that what they're about is providing long-term housing. I think that is true largely currently, but I do have concerns about how things can change over time. And so we see, for example, in the US, where the institutional sector is much more well developed, that institutional landlords are actually more likely to evict, according to some of the evidence, than small-scale landlords in some US cities. We see that evictions for renovation by institutional landlords have become significant issues, both in the US, but also in countries like Sweden and Denmark, leading to new legislation being introduced to clamp down on that, at least in Denmark. So while institutional landlords in Ireland at the moment mainly own new apartments, and they mainly have a model which appears to be focused on long-term rental income streams, market cycles will change and the nature of business strategies will change. So if we were to have a different approach to institutional landlords, we would just need to make sure it would be an approach that would function through different market contexts, and not assume that what is pertaining now will pertain forever.
Okay. A question here on language. The term accidental landlord is used in a broader sense to cover other cases, such as keep the house and buy a new one, for instance. Perhaps temporary landlord would be a better term.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I did provide some in one of the slides, and the RTB survey on small landlords is really instructive on this, because we see 46% of landlords have purchased their property with an owner-occupier mortgage. But then on the other hand, the majority see their private rental property, describe it as a long-term investment. This is all from the RTB survey. And it would appear that even landlords who are expanding their rental property, this is my interpretation of the RTB survey data anyway, are also using owner-occupier mortgages. So it's not really clear exactly what's going on, to me anyway, with some of these landlords, and the extent to which they're better understood as accidental or temporary, or more so as kind of conscious, explicit investors in residential property. But certainly the term accidental landlord is not one I love myself. So I like that idea of a temporary landlords.
How do you guarantee that there will be no policy change within the 6-year period? This questioner asks. I doubt landlords would sign up to 6-year fixed term tenancies coupled with the risk of regulatory change. So, for example, this questioner says if Sinn Féin were in government, landlords might easily find that there is an eviction ban at the end of the 6-year period. Do you think landlords would take that risk?
Well, in a democracy, nobody is insulated from policy change in any market. So governments can change, and obviously, so that's just a reality of any form of investment. So if people are wanting to invest in something which is free from policy change, they're going to find themselves with very few options of where to invest their money. However, the best way to reduce the frequency of policy change is to come up with approaches to policy which have a reasonable degree of cross-party support and social consensus. And we see that in countries like Austria and Germany that have very, very stable housing systems. There's a very, very strong buy-in, not just from different political parties of different persuasions, but also from the public into the housing model. So I do think that I think probably landlords will find it currently a little bit difficult to have confidence that policy change is not going to happen, because there has been an awful lot in recent years. But I would hope over time that if we can come up with a framework that does have widespread buy-in and which functions, then that would lead to more confidence among landlords over time. But the transition might be challenging.
I think you might have answered this in the presentation. Would you anticipate a rollover of the 6-year tenancy if the landlord does not wish to recover it at the end of the 6 years?
Yes.
Yeah. What rules of rent increase would you recommend for the 6-year contracts?
I think the RPZ measures are very robust. 2% per annum is quite a strong form of rent regulation. It's one of the strongest forms of rent regulation that you're going to find in the world, to be frank. There are obviously problems with compliance. The bigger issue, I think, is the gulf that's emerging between existing tenancies where the landlord is compliant and new tenancies, or tenancies where the landlord isn't compliant, which is obviously growing over time. And I know that the Housing Commission seems to recommend maybe moving to a different model, which would be linked to a reference rent type system. Such a model is what's used in Germany, for example, although there's the report of the Housing Commission doesn't provide details. But I think as long as the tenant is protected from significant within tenancy increases, that would really be the what would be most important from the point of view of what I've been talking about this morning.
Okay, I have 3 questions left. We have 5 minutes, so we'll try and get to them.
Rapid fire round.
Yeah, in a rising property market, might prohibiting a notice to quit for sale reduce supply, as a landlord who has a vague intention to sell in the medium term will be unlikely to let their dwelling or rent their dwelling if they know they won't then be able to serve a notice to quit at the top of the market.
Yes, is the short answer. I mean, it will be a disincentive for a cohort of investors. But a couple of things that I would point out there. First of all, my view is landlords who can't commit to any time period and of any reasonable time, I would just have a big question about the extent to which they can really contribute to creating a housing system that works. Because the nature of housing is just not amenable with people for that type of investment. Now, that is a problem in terms of supply, but that is a supply hit, if you like, that I think is outweighed by the benefits. And so essentially what I would be arguing is that where we need to kind of counterbalance that, we'll need that additional supply from in the homeowner segment, in the cost rental segment, in the affordable home ownership segment, social housing, etc. But the other thing is that I think is worth highlighting is that the nature of landlord investment, and there's great research on this, for example, comparing Germany and England, is linked to the policy context. So if you have a policy context, both in terms of taxation and in terms of housing policy that supports longer term investment, then you'll end up with landlords that who meet that profile. If you have a system that favors shorter term investment horizons, flipping, and essentially more speculative type activity, then you'll get a cohort of landlords that reflect that. So we can change the profile of landlords as well over time, but I do acknowledge that there would be a negative supply impact to some degree.
Okay, we have time for one more question. I have 3 on the screen here. I'll take the shortest one because we're running out of time. A large number of those renting are licensees, and these are often the most vulnerable but least protected. Do you envisage these arrangements being part of a future rental sector? And if so, how do you envisage they are regulated?
Well, that is a very good question, and I don't have an answer for that. Yeah, the licensee issue is hugely important and has been more or less ignored, or so, and including by me. So I don't have an answer for that. So I'm not going to spoof and waffle, but that's definitely something that I haven't given enough consideration to. But that is a very thorny question, because now you've got landlords and tenants living in the same house, and that is a very difficult thing to context within which to provide security to tenants.
Okay, it's a very thorny issue across the board, the private rental sector. And I'm sure we'll be coming back to it in future Simon Talks. Dr. Michael Byrne, thank you so much for your time and for, as you called it, this thought experiment. It's been a lively presentation, a very lively discussion. There's a couple of questions here you might be able to get to offline, and we'll share them with you. Wayne will be back with you for the next Simon Talks. Thanks to Rebecca in the Simon Communities of Ireland for all her help this morning. And thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everybody.